Good morning. I'm joined by Dr. Richard Windsor from Edison's tech team to discuss mobile ecosystems. Richard,
Hi, good morning.
Thanks for coming. Can you start by describing to us how you analyse the space?
Okay. Well, the whole research product came about because when you listen to tech companies talk, everybody from Apple all the way down to the smallest Chinese players, they always mention the word ecosystem, but no one can actually tell you what it means. The aim of the research product is basically to explain and evaluate what the ecosystems are. The way we see an ecosystem, quite simply, is an ecosystem is the environment within which a user will live his digital life, i.e. where he does all the sorts of things that he does on his smartphone, like texting, playing games, communicating, etc., etc., etc. Now, the way we analyse it in two ways. The first one is this concept what we call digital life. And digital life, it's basically a pie chart which is it's split up into all the different activities that the user does on a smartphone divided by time. And what we do is you take an ecosystem and you ascertain which services it has an offering for. And then based on how well it covers the pie, it gets a score out of 100. And that gives you an idea of how good the coverage is.
And to what extent does integration of that coverage matter? Because I can imagine that a Google, which has all of its offerings effectively available through a single login and platform,
yes,
perhaps does better than an Apple whose offering perhaps comes from third-party services through the App Store.
In terms of monetization via advertising, integration is absolutely critical because you need to build up a profile of the user, and that profile needs to be for everything that he does, not just one service. For those that monetize through hardware, which is what Apple does, it's less important. But I think it will become more relevant going forward. And at the moment, pretty much it's only Google that does it right. Everybody else there's different services are not integrated well at all. So this is going to be an increasingly important issue going forward.
Interesting. We'll probably come back to that. And can you just go into the second method, the
yes.
three laws of robustness?
So once you've looked at how well they cover digital life, you then have to say, well, how good are they? And we have these three rules, which probably will be expanded in future as the research develops. The three rules as they stand today are easy and fun to use, pretty obvious really, easy and fun to set it up, and capture traffic on your own servers. Okay, so set it up basically means you pick it up and you just log in and it works. Capture traffic on your own servers is very important for the monetization, again, through advertising, which is where most people are going, because if you don't capture that traffic on your own server with your own service, you're not going to know what that user is doing. And therefore, you can't sell the data to get the money from advertising. Now, a lot of people think that the advertising is not a particularly good method of monetization. But for example, this year Google is going to earn somewhere around about $11 billion from advertising on mobile phones, and it will cost them not much at all. So it's a hugely profitable business if you can get it right.
And of the two main players, who are, I suppose, Apple and Google, what are their relative weaknesses for each ecosystem? Okay,
and that's the interesting thing that's thrown up by this analysis is that the first thing is that Apple's main weakness is the fact that it doesn't cover digital life very well. Now, to be differentiated in the real long term, you need to have exclusive digital life services that you can only get on an Apple device. Because if you don't, then if you can get the same services to the same level of quality on other devices, why am I paying $640 for an Apple device when I can get the same thing for $300? So, and that's, I think, if you look at what Apple has been doing in terms of what they're doing with developers, how they're developing their operating system and their services, I can start to see Apple making the first moves to address this problem. And they're doing it via these things like HealthKit, HomeKit, Apple Pay, which will be exclusive to Apple.
Interesting. And the same question applied to Google?
Yes, but Google's weaknesses are actually the other way around. Google's weaknesses is that because of Android is open source, there's an awful lot of fragmentation. So people implement the software differently. So you get a slightly different user experience. So there's a lack of consistency across all these different devices, which means that, and this is why Android devices generate less traffic than iOS devices, because they're more difficult to use, they're more difficult to set up, they're not as fun, they're more frustrating. And so people use them less. And what Google is doing is Google is trying to address that by starting to take more and more control of the Android user experience. So the idea being it's completely consistent across any device.
And who are the big challenges to those two? I suppose Samsung's taken itself out of the game, but Microsoft strong in the area?
Microsoft is the forefront of the challenges. Market share remains still miles below what it should be, given the assets that they've got, given the amount of money that they've got to invest, given their incredibly strong position in the enterprise. And it all really comes down to execution. So Microsoft is up there in terms of opportunity, but has yet to really show momentum in this space. Yahoo is right there. Again, execution is the biggest problem that Yahoo has. And then you've also got, the Chinese companies are all starting to try and emulate this whole digital life, mobile ecosystem environment. But I suspect this is largely going to be driven by the Chinese market.
Interesting. And the Chinese market really big enough to drive its own three big players, potentially.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you look at one of the yardsticks that we use to measure how good an ecosystem is, and how successful it is, well, how big is it? And the funny thing is that nobody seems to do this. We're the only people who actually try and count the number of users. And the yardsticks that we use are that an ecosystem needs to be 100 million users or more to be viable, and 300 million users or more to be really successful. Now, if you look at China, a couple of years down the line, China's going to have comfortably 1 billion smartphone users. So that's enough space for 3 really big ones, and there are 3 really big companies that want it, which is Baidu, Tencent, and Alibaba.
And where does Xiaomi sit in on that?
Well, Xiaomi would kind of be a challenger. The interesting thing about Xiaomi is now the #1 smartphone vendor in China. And the incredible thing about Xiaomi is Xiaomi actually has its own media offering through video and through music, with its own software on top of Android. And its devices in China actually register more use than iPhones do.
Interesting.
Which is quite surprising. And it kind of implies that Xiaomi, because many of the problems with the hardware makers is they just don't get it. They don't understand the importance of the ecosystem. But that is pointing to the fact that Xiaomi actually gets it. And so Xiaomi has an opportunity to develop an ecosystem and take its place in the Chinese market. The problem with it is that compared to those 3 big ones, it's tiny with very few resources.
Is there an opportunity for a company like that, though, in the rest of Southeast Asia? Large population, more and more well off.
In theory, yes, but it's quite interesting is if you buy a Xiaomi phone in India and you try and log on to the service, it ends up being in Chinese. So there's a bit of a distance to go here. And this is the thing, is what makes Xiaomi attractive in China could be its Chinese ecosystem and its content, etc., etc. That has no relevance in India whatsoever. And in India, it's going to be just competing on price with everyone else.
I see. One other thing, talking about form factor, Apple's done this a couple of times with the iPod and the iPad. They've come up with a device which users prefer to existing things, which people perhaps didn't see coming. What about Microsoft and others who make what could be the next replacement for a laptop or a PC in terms of separating the screen and the keyboard?
I think that's definitely the case. The interesting thing is that when you look at the PC makers and you look at Microsoft's ability to innovate in the form factor, not just on tablets, but also if you look at what they could do on peripherals, keyboards and mice and things, Microsoft is so much better than any of the other PC makers in terms of coming up with innovative form factors. And when I look at the other guy, when I look at, even look at Lenovo, which is one of these up-and-coming ones, you look at HP and Dell, they are so embedded in the laptop form factor that they just haven't seen it coming.
It's an interesting thing to me because, in a way, we all sit at our desk with a screen there and a keyboard that's only attached to it via a box under the desk and a wire. So the form factor is not necessarily that different. So will the education of the potential consumers of it be difficult, or is it just marketing?
I think it's just marketing, and that's why I call this concept. I actually call this concept portable desktop. That the Surface Pro product, this is why Microsoft has huge problems. Microsoft markets the Surface Pro as a laptop. The Surface Pro is not a laptop, it's a portable desktop. And they just haven't clicked yet.
Very interesting to see how it develops. Richard, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
If you'd like any more information, please do contact Edison's institutional team at our offices on High Hope.